All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Patrick Lawrence. I'm chair and professor in the Department of Geography and Planning here at the University of Toledo. And welcome this morning to our academic symposium as part of the celebration events today and this week for the inauguration of our new president, Dr. Shane Gabriel. Our theme today is creating a social compact between Greater Toledo and the University of Toledo. We have a number of speakers with us this morning. We're going to do this in a sort of panel open discussion, kind of informal a little bit. We have a few topics we're going to go through. Folks are going to chime in terms of their expertise, both locally here in Toledo, and also we have two distinguished guests who are joining us today. After that wraps up, we're going to have an open Q&A session for questions from the audience, reflecting upon some of what we've talked about this morning. So to begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists this morning, and we're going to work from my left. Next to me is Reverend John Jones, Associate Vice President, Governance Office in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at ProMedica. Welcome. Thanks. Next to him is Dr. Michael Deere, Professor Emeritus of the City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. Thanks for joining us. Of course, next to him is Dr. Sharon Gaber, President of the University of Toledo. And we have Dr. Kenneth Reardon, Professor and Director of the Graduate Program in Urban Planning and Community Development at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And then finally, at the far end, is Dr. Reid, Professor of Geography and Planning here at the University of Toledo and Director of the Jack Ford Urban Affairs Center, based here at the university. We've asked our two guests today to start with some leading comments. So whoever wants to chime in first, let's get started.
I think Michael's going first.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're going from west to east.
That'll work.
Hi, I'm really pleased to be here because this is a big day for Sharon and for all of us and for Toledo and the university. I want to say a few words about Sharon so you know what you've got as a president.
Why does this worry me?
At least I didn't bring the home videos and pictures to show you. I met Sharon when she was a student at University of Southern California. She was a very successful student, not a retiring flower, but a very successful student. And in fact, the one thing that we did right at USC at that time was to give her the award for the outstanding potential amongst all the graduating class. I think that's what we got right there, because this celebration is indicative that that potential is now being realized. I also would like to say a little bit about her academic career, because it's one of those careers where you look at it and you think, if I blink or if I turn my head away for a second, Sharon has made some new achievement. And her record is outstanding. It makes me feel that I've actually wasted my life when I look at it curriculum. But she did work very early on with me in coursework and so on in respect to the Nimbyism phenomenon, which is to say, not in my backyard, where people were objecting to certain kinds of developments in their communities, in particular human services. It's also known as banana, which means, NIMBY means not in my backyard, banana means build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. That means it's a very restrictive approach to the way communities can develop. Sharon made some really significant contributions in that development, and I still use her work in my classes at Berkeley. She went on after USC to do a PhD in Cornell, by which she was moving away from being a California person to an East Coast person, so she's actually very well equipped to deal with the conversations on both coasts. I think the thing that's driven her for a long time is this move from knowledge to action, which is characteristic of planning and other professions, other design professions, and you'll see that in her work. She's published in the top journals. She did everything in her first 12 years that you would imagine a professor would do. She became, in those early years, a leading academic in the field. It's when you look at what she did after that that becomes amazing. She became an outstanding academic in that period. But then over the next 10 years, she actually went through a meteoric rise. And I looked at her CV quite carefully. In the first part of that second decade, she was a chair of a department in a Midwestern university. By the end of that decade, she was a provost and a vice chancellor. I actually know very few people, very, very few people who could match that record. So you have someone here now who's got an outstanding academic credentials in at least two major universities. And over the last 10 years has proven herself to be an extraordinary professional administrator. So I'm delighted to be with you on this day to celebrate the work that she's done. Substantial work in fields of disability, in human services and so on, homeless populations, refugees, and with a huge emphasis in her work throughout her career on the status of women. So she is outstanding. Toledo could not have done better. That said, with my greatest admiration, let's move on to another piece of the conversation. This is my first visit to Toledo, and it's really an interesting challenge that we've been presented with. When we were visiting here, several people, in anticipation of our visit, sent us some materials that we could learn about Toledo. And I've got one message for you to kick off the discussion. If you look at the context of what's happening in the urban world these days, it looks extremely complicated. But it's not that complicated if you start to think about what the structure of the problem is, and then, under that context, how to respond to the context in Toledo. So if you want to understand what's happening in cities globally now, we have to look at globalization. We have to look at the rise of technological society. We have to understand that our communities are becoming increasingly unequal, and this is a global-wide phenomenon. Communities are also becoming increasingly diverse. Diversity is one of the hallmarks, really, which is, of course, linked to the widespread migration that is a global phenomenon right now. And then the last thing that I want to emphasize to you is sustainability. It's obviously something that's on a lot of people's minds, even Obama today when he's talking with the Chinese premier about climate change. So I'm not oversimplifying if I say that understanding global cities, cyber cities, unequal cities, hybrid cities, diversity, and sustainable cities, that's really the 5 keys to unlocking what is essentially a very complicated global problem. That said, what about Toledo? Toledo is part of that global phenomenon, right? There's no doubt, but the world is in Toledo, and Toledo is in the world. So things that are happening across the other side of the planet are influencing what happens in this city right now. And understanding that, I think, makes me rephrase the nature of the issues following Toledo. And there's 1 or 2 rephrasings I want to suggest. One is that we're all Toledoans now. This is a mid-sized American city, small to mid-sized American city, but there's no way to escape that globalization aspect. Now, that globalization is going to affect different places in different ways. We are not Detroit. You are not Los Angeles. If you were in different places, the experience of globalization and all these trends are going to be experienced in different ways. But if we are all Toledoans, I can't say that, John, but, if we are from Toledo now, then being exposed to those global phenomena is inevitable. Therefore, and this is my last comment before I pass to my colleague, in terms of being a practicing professional planner, I'm always concerned, as Sharon is, I know, in moving from knowledge to action, as are a great deal of other professions as well. But the first thing that I want to recommend, and the first move that I would recommend to my colleagues, is to get rid of this notion of the Rust Belt. Because I don't know how many Lucas and Wade and Toledo documents I've waded through over the past couple of weeks referring to the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is an 80s thing. It's gone. There's no need to discuss the Rust Belt in Toledo anymore. So my first move, Ken, from knowledge to action, is to say, get rid of that and find a different way of discussing what's happening in this region. It could be creative Toledo. I really don't mind what it is, and I don't presume to tell you how to describe your own community. but having learned a lot already about the really very impressive shifts that are occurring in this region, something new and interesting and exciting is developing. It's not Rust Belt. It has nothing to do with the Rust Belt. Please, get the white out or whatever it is that we need, or hit the delete button and move forward to try to find a different way of talking about it, because that's what's actually needed right now, based on good evidence, good information, which we have because you have some wonderful scholars on this campus, and move forward. Ken, how do we move forward?
All right, Michael. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. As Michael mentioned, Sharon and I have had a long history. I was finishing up my PhD at Cornell when Sharon was just a couple of classes behind me, and I had the good fortune of recommending her for her first academic job. She replaced me as a lecturer and senior lecturer running an interdisciplinary urban studies program for Cornell in New York City. And I think some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are referenced about in terms of her later career. Michael's done in his usual elegant and job describing Sharon's early intellectual curiosity and passion and record of accomplishment. Looking at a more recent career, the first thing one is struck by is, how does someone who has this ascending set of responsibilities as a department head, associate dean, associate provost of very large public universities in the South have time to maintain an active research program? But Sharon's been able to do that. It's generated over $1.5 million in grants supporting dozens of graduate students at these various institutions, as well as young faculty. One of the things that I've heard through our disciplinary association is the care to which she has gone to identify, cultivate, support young scholars to make sure in this increasingly competitive environment that they get off to a good start and a successful career. Not only doing scholarship in the abstract, but scholarship that relates to the most pressing environmental, economic, and social issues confronting the communities where the institutions that she has served exist. So first of all, you need to note that she is an active member of the Academy who cares about important questions, are able to frame them in a way that's attractive to external funders, and then to manage work so that that scholarship actually generates important scholarly, professional, and popular documents that are shaping narratives, shaping policy discussions in the communities where she's worked and nationally. She is somebody who's held in very high regard in the field of urban and regional planning, and someone who's been in great demand at other institutions. She was a candidate at Memphis. When we were not smart enough to hire her, I immediately gave up and moved to the University of Massachusetts at Boston. I couldn't imagine seeing her at another institution, but I'm glad to be part of this. So she has a substantial record. The second thing is not only the volume, but the quality of her contribution to scholarship in the field of urban and regional planning. And I would just cite one of her most recent publications. It's a 2007 co-authored book on qualitative research methods for planners and policymakers. Not an argument that qualitative methods should be used instead of the more standard quantitative approaches to understanding the social world, but in a complementary way, an argument for us to be able to move towards mixed methods research. And this book, published in 2007 by the American Planning Association Press, I think it's fair to say has become a standard, a classic in our field, something that every young graduate student and young professional practicing on our field will want in their library and will want in the repertoire of understanding and competence. So there's a significant amount of work. It's a work that has moved the dial in terms of the way we understand complex urban systems, and it's work that's being used to uncover new opportunities for economic and community development in communities. The other thing is, if you look at Sharon's list of publications, both scholarly and professional, you'll see a dizzying array of topics that she has covered. Some perhaps skeptical aging academics might say, well, she has an attention deficit problem. She can't seem to focus on one thing and stick with it. It's just the opposite of that. Sharon is somebody who listens, I think, deeply and eloquently to the people that she is working with, whether it's in community, local public institutions, or the academy. And so that her scholarship is not only engaged in community, using the community as a lab, but it's responsive to the knowledge, requirements and policy-related research that the communities where she has worked need. And that shows enormous skill in terms of understanding the context in which you're working, and then the ability to assemble folks from a variety of disciplines to put together the kind of research teams that can make an impact on everything from rural economic development to transportation alternatives to AIDS prevention, the reorganization of healthcare, et cetera. And she's covered all of these things in recent professional and scholarly work. The other couple things I just want to say about Sharon that makes her, I think, a unique member of the Academy is her ability, uncanny ability, to look at the policy implications of research. Not just, I'm able to describe the world as it is and maybe the way it could be, but to actually then assist people who are in the public, private, nonprofit sector to identify meaningful, workable, available, politically viable strategies for moving good ideas from conceptualization to implementation, so that they actually make a difference in the lives of people where they work, worship, play, and employed. And that's extraordinary. And I think one of the explanations for this is that Sharon has a highly participatory approach to doing her scholarship, and I would also argue in managing the higher educational institutions that she's been a part of. She understands the kind of diversity that Michael's talking about, not only disciplinary, but the identities that people bring, the increasingly international nature of the campus and the community. And she is committed to involving the variety of stakeholders that are going to be affected by critical research, policy, and management decisions in the process at every step of the way, from problem identification to designing the research and actually doing the analysis and implementation. And the last thing I would like to say is that in more recent years, obviously with Sharon's movement up the higher ed leadership structure, she has been responsible for creating and crafting a culture in the institutions where she has worked, where faculty realize that research is valued and it needs to relate to instruction. Research is valued, it needs to enrich and be a critical part of what goes on in the classroom, but that agenda also needs to be connected to the broader set of economic and community development needs of the city and the region. And she has, both at Auburn and I've watched from just across the river in Arkansas, helped two institutions for which that wasn't a taken for granted understanding of excellence and scholarship. She has helped create an environment in which young scholars are supported to integrate what often is siloed activities of the academy, which really limits the impact of each one of those things. And I think that's why you are fortunate that you made an inspired choice, because you have somebody who is going to build upon the strength and momentum that's clearly already here at the University of Toledo, and also the exciting new civic leadership that's emerging within the city to craft a common ground agenda that will be a fruitful spot for both longtime civic leaders and university academy members to sit down and work in a collaborative way to address the problems that not only face Toledo, but every major urban center in the US and abroad. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to our esteemed chair.
Well, in thinking about what we've heard so far, Dr. Gabriel, how should the city of Toledo and the university respond? What kind of action activity, what kind of resources do we have in our community to bring to bear to think about a social compact between the university and the city?
Right, which I think is what many people came today to hear about, as opposed to my cheerleaders who joined me, which I am very thankful for. And if you all haven't realized, these people have known me for a long time, and I have a great deal of, yes, since I was that tall, a great deal of respect and admiration for them, but they probably should have been here during the sales time, and we could have expedited the search, right? But I appreciate them being here today. Part of what we've, and I guess quickly I want to say, we have several members of our Board of Trustees here, we have a former president of the university here, several vice presidents, but for the faculty and students and staff that are here, I'm really appreciative. Part of what we've talked about all along is how the university and the city are working together and how we continue to do that. And it's been very interesting during this time, so I'm almost 3 full months on the job of meeting with civic leaders, meeting with individuals on campus. What we're talking about is increasing research activity on campus and increasing our campus participation in the community. And we're doing quite a bit, and you all collectively know this. And what we're talking about is how do we continue that and expand upon it. And so for the students who are involved in service learning opportunities, I had the opportunity to go to the mayor's office, and as I walk in, 2 students are right outside the mayor's door working and interning with her. And she said, well, we'd obviously love to have more students working within the government building with any of the city offices. We have the Lake Erie Center, which I've had the opportunity to visit, which is doing incredible work, looking at everything that's going on in Lake Erie, obviously issues of algal bloom, to what do we do about making sure that we've got clean water to swim in. I have to point out Patrick Lawrence here, who I think I was on the job perhaps 1 week, who was on my calendar to make sure that I was touring the river on campus to see what has happened and the way that we've created a beautiful river corridor, the cleanup that's happened, and the efforts that he has done with students, with staff, with faculty, and with community, really to enhance the river here and beyond. Because it was interesting, I was out on Saturday when 340 students and community members were out with Patrick at 8 a.m. for more river cleanup. And it was raining. People were out after, I believe it was after a football game. No, the football game was later that day. And to be out in the rain to do a river cleanup, and that he commanded that audience to get them interested and willing to do that, and it was beyond the campus confines, was really incredible. You all know what we're doing, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in teacher education. What I'd say is we want to continue to do more, and continuously the campus and the city, we work together. As we enhance the university, and we will be doing that, it enhances Toledo, so that people who come here from the outside understand what's going on, what are we doing here, and how are we making strides to move forward. I think the point about the Rust Belt city, and I think it's interesting because if that is in our promotional materials or discussion of what we've had, we shouldn't refer to it as a former Rust Belt city. It should really be discussed as a current emerging city and a transforming city, and you'll probably come up with another title for it. We can bet on that, okay? But we know that we're going through a transformation in terms of what the city is. We do still have advanced manufacturing here, but we also have emerging healthcare hub. We also have emerging, work on water issues that is very important. We have an important human trafficking institute that really has some definition. And we know that the city has historically been known as the glass city. We still have hubs of that here and important offshoots associated with what's going on in glass industry. So with that,
Good.
Thank you.
Well, and Neil, I guess the question then raises, what is our capacity and resources here in the city of Toledo? What is our current state? And perhaps you can highlight for us some of the assets and opportunities that we have available.
Okay, let's begin with the challenges, because Michael mentioned Rust Belt City. There's another term that is out in the literature, and that's a shrinking city. A city that's losing population, a city that's losing its kind of economic base. So let me just begin with some numbers here. Since the year 2000, the population of the city of Toledo fell from 314,000 to 281,000. That's a decrease of 10.4%. And it's not just the city that's kind of losing population, but we also look at the county, Lucas County as well. If you look at the same period, the number of jobs in Lucas County fell from 205,000 to 178,000, a decrease of 13.1%. So whether we like it or not, we clearly are a shrinking city, which may not be bad. It also presents challenges, but I think it also presents opportunities. We're also a city that's changing in terms of our economic base. We have this history of automobile production and the glass industry, and we have this heritage of manufacturing. But the manufacturing sector is declining at least as an employer in Toledo and Lucas County. So again, if I give you some numbers, in 2001, about 15.4% of the jobs in Lucas County were in the manufacturing sector. Today, that figure is about 12.7%. The largest employer in Lucas County, and it's fantastic that we have John here, is the healthcare sector. 21.5% of the jobs, 1 in 5 of the jobs in Lucas County is in the healthcare sector. And that is up from 16.7% in 2001. So we're clearly shifting here in terms of the types of jobs that people are doing and the way they earn their paychecks. But I would still argue that manufacturing is still important to this region. There was a recent article in Forbes magazine in which Joe Kotkin referred to Toledo as a Midwestern manufacturing hotspot that was making some resurgence in terms of its manufacturing sector. 2 years ago, I published a paper in a journal called Cities, and this was published with a graduate student of mine, Mike Moore, and also a colleague from the University of Arizona, Gordon Mulligan. And what we did, we looked at the economic health of 357 metropolitan areas across the United States. And based on our analysis, we kind of placed each of these metropolitan areas into kind of one of 4 categories, kind of from good to bad, if you will. And as we were doing this analysis, I was kind of going to be curious as to where Toledo was going to end up. And I was pleasantly surprised because we ended up in the second of those 4 tiers, what Gordon and I referred to as a metropolitan area with brightening economic prospects. And that kind of goes with what Joe Kotkin was saying as being a kind of manufacturing hotspot. So there is hope there. So one of the questions is, what will it take for Toledo to kind of prosper in the future? And there's kind of lots of different ways to look at this. But again, I'm a kind of academic, so I like to read what others have said, my colleagues in academia. And there was a very, very interesting paper published in 2005 by Ed Glazer, who's an economist at Harvard University. And Ed produced this fantastic paper in which he looked at the city of Boston from the late 1600s up until the present day. And as you can imagine, over a 300-year period, a city goes through lots of kind of ups and downs. And, one of the comments that Ed made was to successfully, argue that cities have to successfully respond to challenges in order to grow and prosper. And if you look at what happened in Boston, it was a shrinking city, just like Toledo was, up until about 1980 or so. And then things kind of turned around in Boston. And in his paper, Glazer identified kind of 4 keys to the kind of revitalization of Boston. One of those, number 1, was livability and quality of life. And what Glazer argued is, and if we think of Toledo, a city doesn't just, we don't want the city to be a place where people just want to work, but we want the city to be a place where people want to live as well. So we have to think about this livability and this quality of life. The second thing that Glazer pointed to was economic diversity. Michael talked about, I think he was talking more about demographic and cultural diversity, but I think it's also important to think about the types of jobs we have and the types of industries we have and ways to diversify that so we're not dependent upon one particular sector, that we don't put all our eggs in one basket, as it were. The third thing that Glazer mentioned was the idea of human capital. And he was really emphasizing the role of the universities in Boston's resurgence, and if we take this to Toledo, the role of the University of Toledo. So we have a very important job to do in terms of educating students with the right skills, but not just with the right skill sets, but also with the right knowledge as well, so that they are adaptable and can change and can respond to the challenges we have here in Toledo. The fourth thing that Glazer mentioned was the idea of good and wise government. And this may come back to the relationship between UT and county government and city government. And Glazer basically argued that government needs to be supportive but not intrusive. We need to have unified, not divisive leadership. It's very important. And the government needs to think very strategically about how it allocates its resources. And he warns against kind of wasting money, and so we have to be very careful about how we allocate those resources. So even though Goeza was talking about Boston, I think you can take some of those ideas going forward and thinking, what role do those have to play with respect to Toledo? So I would argue that even though we are a shrinking city, and again, we may not get back to where we were in the 1970s in terms of population, that doesn't mean that we're down and out. It doesn't mean we don't have a bright future, but we have to think about that future strategically. Think about the globalization, the change that's taking place, and as Glazer say, responding to that change in order that we can kind of grow and prosper in the next decade and the decades after that.
Thank you. Well, John, we've got sort of a challenge ahead of us, some opportunities here, but also some assets in our community that we need to take advantage, that we can leverage. You want to comment about some of those and how they could come into the play?
Absolutely. First of all, it's great to be here on campus, and especially during this weekend, and just to dovetail off of what Dr. Deere and Dr. Reardon have shared, I think it's exciting to hear some of the background from people who are close to you. It's sort of hard listening to it.
A little too behind the scenes,
No,
right?
It's a little hard. But one of the things is if a person is really humble, they don't really talk about themselves a lot. So it's good to hear other people talk about them in a non-sales way. So the sales is all gone. So this is sort of either you paid them real well or it's all real in what they share. But I think the key of that is listening to what has been shared already is really how do we focus on quality of life. And so when you think about what are the important components of a city and a community, you can really narrow it down to, you can talk about the businesses and you can have big businesses and people can come and work, but if there's no place for them, to your point, Dr. Reid, to play and to live, you really have a declining community. And so when you think about good schools, good hospitals, good arts communities, things of that nature, those are the critical components of how a city not only grows, but how they are able to collaborate. And so when you think about University of Toledo, they really are, to use one of my mentor's phrases, University of Toledo is the cradle of intelligence. And so when you think about that space for Toledo, how do you then dovetail that and really build on that space to draw a couple things out of it? Number one, the demographic diversity is crucial. And so the university represents a diverse population of people automatically. How does the city then use that connectivity that's here on campus to get those students, those professors, all of the staff that's there, how do they then infiltrate throughout the community and really show themselves to prove that not only there's great learning that goes on here, but there's also great action that takes place. And so the diversity component is huge when you think about urban communities, and whether we want to believe it or not, Toledo is an urban community. And there are clear and defined inequalities that one would see and exist, whether that's in our school systems or even in our health systems. And those are things that are being addressed, that I know of, being addressed on a daily basis by partners that are working not only with the university to say, how can we learn from this? How can we use the skill set, the talent, the knowledge that's there? But then how do we actually put that into action? And so the demographic diversity is clear and a necessity for what we need. And I wouldn't just place it on the race and the ethnicity and the gender, which is where we often get stuck with when you say the word diversity. You get stuck there, but I also think about industries, skill sets, various things that allow a person, and really your background, what things that you have experienced in your life that you bring to bear, whether that's in the workplace, in community development, community building, as it relates to things that are right now in front of our face, whether that is within urban communities. You've got, different pieces of violent activity that people are addressing to say, how can we change the course of that? How can we change the cradle to prison pipeline that exists in many different ways, and find ways to actually move people from a place of sort of, I wouldn't say desperation, but some would even call it that, but move them from there to a place to say, you know what, there is a piece of hope. There are some things out here that are positive to be able to do. And from a school perspective, an education perspective, that is important. From a health perspective, that is important as well. Being with a health system, it is clear that our role is to not just say we're going to fix you when you come inside of our doors. Our role is to actually go out into community and find where are those disparate gaps, and then work collectively and in partnership with other organizations, with other entities, to say how can we bridge those gaps before you get to the problem. And within healthcare, we found over the past 20 years easily, we have spent so much money on, we got to fix you. You come in, we fix you, and we'll fix you and we'll send you home and you'll come back to us. And we don't want to see that continue to happen. We want to see how can we work on that on the front end and prevent things before they become issues. And I think that is really where the university, our organizations that are here, businesses that are here, as well as the religious sector, education sector, all of that space, how can we work in cohesion to really draw that out and really see the social space improve, which then improves the overall quality of life of all of our residents and citizens, or Toledoans that are here.
Well, Ken, we've talked a lot about the knowledge base that we have. We understand some of the problems, we understand some of the challenges, opportunities, and the assets that are available to us. But let's start making a shift now, thinking about how do we move from that knowledge to action?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the initial things is to get a better sense of how is University of Toledo students, faculty, and staff already engaged in community, and make sure we have as complete a picture of that as possible. A simple thing that we often resist doing, but is available to us, is just to alter very simply the annual activity report faculty fill out to explicitly address community engagement and geocode that so we can map who's working where on what kinds of issues, and facilitate the creation of a database that would allow on-campus interdisciplinary work and easier connection and transparency to the community. I think a second thing is, and Michael and others have talked about this, is that in these older central cities, industrial cities, we're not going to refer to them ever again as Rust Belt cities. The Lincoln Land Institute, they refer to them as legacy cities, cities that are over 50,000 that have lost substantial employment and population base. They've identified the eds and meds as one of the critical drivers of future economic development. So, you know, one of the things we have to look at is how is the university and their medical partners using their own spending, their own economic activities to either strengthen the Toledo economy or perhaps inadvertently, unconsciously undermine it. To look at what we can do to buy local, to create an emphasis and a set of policies where we purchase as much as possible in terms of material, offering contracts, et cetera, to Toledo and Toledo region-based business organizations. That would go a long way to really expanding opportunities in terms of new business and employment. I think the other thing that Sharon made reference to is that there are hot spots within the regional economy that distinguish Toledo from many other older industrial cities where there is real action. And I think mobilizing teams of folks who can do industry cluster studies that examine not what is the current footprint and set of activities in, let's say, advanced manufacturing and the glass industry, but what are the sunrise business opportunities for the next 10 and 20 years, and how do we think about the technology we've created within these traditional businesses and apply it to new product groups, new regions of the world to do business, and different ways of marketing and distributing Toledo knowledge and goods and services. So I think looking at, first of all, mapping where we're at, who's doing what, and finding a way that we can quickly find out who is in East Toledo, who I could collaborate with on campus and make those connections easier. Second, I think looking at really adjusting the way we think about purchasing goods and services to buy local, both our healthcare partner and the university, to increase the percentage of local sourcing. And then I think to focus our intellectual capital on those business clusters that have a pulse, that are currently doing well, but we have to look at the next horizon. What are the emerging product demands and services and regions of delivery that we need to be thinking about, and try to help those industrial sectors look to not the immediate term, but the longer run, the sunrise opportunities that exist in the global economy.
Michael, what do you think? What else do we need to kind of get things moving?
I don't need to say anything. Ken's taken care of it all, as usual. No, thank you, Ken. So seriously, okay, so I'm going to call it Prosperous Livable Toledo. PLT is what I want to talk about. I also want to emphasize something that comes out in a lot of this discussion, and Neil brought it up too. I thought the remarks, Neil, were very helpful. There's a lot of talk about best practices. And it's so important to realize how place differs. You know, Toledo is not Detroit, is not Los Angeles, and so on. And things that work in some places will not work in all places. So what we've talked about now in terms of, and John talked about this too, what are the resources that we have on hand that we can actually build on? And I like that approach a great deal. I also would think that we need to do more about thinking outside the box. And I'll just tell you something that just came to my mind when I was preparing for this visit. You have just instituted one of the few majors in this country, undergraduate majors on disability studies. Now, I hate to say this, but as an aging superstar, I'm conscious of aging and disability. We all get disabled. And I congratulate you in actually making a major, an undergraduate major out of this. We have an undergraduate minor at Berkeley in disability studies. It's tremendously popular and appeals to a lot of people who are interested in service as much as education, John. And so at the same time I was reading about this and admiring you and congratulating you for taking this initiative, I was reading about the Special Olympics in Los Angeles this year. And I thought there's a niche that if I was in Toledo, that's what I want to be thinking about, how we can build for a large number of, an increasing number of our population nationwide and make a link between an important program at this university with, in essence, a global movement about disability rights. That's just a small thing. You might have lots of other and more pertinent examples, but I'm just very taken by that as someone who's been interested in the disability field for most of my life. I will say one thing about moving from knowledge to action, and this builds a little bit on Ken. Most movements in a local region require some champions. Right, when I visited Detroit recently, and there's that fellow downtown who's just buying up everything. I can't remember his name right now, but you know who I mean. That person, no matter whether you like what he's doing or not, is a champion of Detroit. And one of the challenges which faces you in this region is to identify who those champions are. I happen to have one sitting on my left already, an emerging.
Thank you, Michael.
An emerging Detroit. Look, there's a little bit of tension on this panel. Let me just be frank about this, right? I mean, Ken is a good guy, but he's a Boston Brahmin. He's on the East Coast. And he looks at me, he knows I'm from the West Coast, so there's an East-left tension here in this panel that I think I should bring out in the open so we can just talk about it frankly.
We did invent hip-hop.
East Coast, West Coast.
It's actually not true. But anyway, here's another champion for Toledo, the work that's going on in the healthcare sector. So, I mean, apart from prosperous, livable Toledo, I now have healthy Toledo, but that's been used quite a bit. So I'm going to ask you guys, because your local knowledge is so important here, is when we're moving forward into action, there are niches, there are regional resources that we can draw upon, but also who are going to be the champions. Toledo, the university is positioning itself to be one of those. And I think that's an entirely appropriate function that should be played. But there are other players as well, and you know, the challenge for you guys is to identify now who's going to carry the heavy weights when we move forward.
Well, President Gabriel, why don't we start with the
I get this,
University of
huh?
Toledo?
Thank you.
Since you've sort of been challenged a little bit there, I think. But in terms of your experience, having come from other institutions and thinking about how universities interact with cities, and now becoming more familiar about our institution and our community, what are some of your initial thoughts about the role of the leadership for the university?
Well, I think it's what we've said. And so to follow up on Michael, and who are the champions and how does this work for the city? I mean, clearly the university, and we've talked about the university being a champion and continuing to work with the city and doing even more. So I've had the good fortune in a short period of time of, I'm on the Chamber of Commerce, I'm on the Regional Growth Partnership. The university is looked to be a leader in this space, and that means faculty, students, staff participating in these areas. But what I'd also say is it's a voice in the research of how do we continue to work with the city, how do we help the city, and then thinking about all of the partners that we have. So ProMedica Health Systems has already made a huge commitment to the city and are relocating corporate headquarters in downtown Toledo. The University of Toledo and ProMedica have signed an academic affiliation which is going to enhance healthcare and healthcare medical education in this community. So as we talk about 21% of the economy right now is in the healthcare sector, I would imagine that will grow over time because of the huge investment that ProMedica is making. I'd also point out to other corporate leaders that we have that we know support this community. And I'm not going to pull them all out, but we can think of major, we've got minor league baseball, we've got hockey downtown. We can think about who's sponsoring those and whose buildings they're in, and we know what that looks like, and they are going to continue to work with the city. But it is incumbent upon all of us, and I guess that's sort of the point, is rather than one champion who's buying up things, we have a number of individuals who are investing time, energy, talent, resources, but it's not the one billionaire that we have that might be doing that. There's probably two handfuls of individuals and corporate interests that are doing that. The other thing I'd mention, and we've talked a little bit about this inventory, is we've done a lot of that inventory work when we applied for the community engaged status from Carnegie, and we are a community engaged university. What I like is almost the idea of putting that into, whether it's geocoding or doing a GIS map so that we know in East Toledo, here's what's going on, and every year almost updating that so we can see what is going on in different regions of the city. When the superintendent of Toledo Public Schools came and talked to me and said, we're doing some great things with your College of Education, we'd like to do more. What we know is we have great opportunity there, and we know that there are great educational needs in this community that we can be a partner in and need to do even more. And so I want to think about how do we do that and how do we get that information, not only in a database format or in a book format, but it probably ought to be on our website that you can pick out in this area, here's the way we're participating. So I think that's a great idea.
And it can be open to the community so
Right.
that they can identify clusters of faculty and staff who can make contributions. And if you're going to meet a state representative or a congressional delegation is being visited, you don't have to get a panicked phone call from the provost. What are we doing in District X? You already have it. It's part of the annual faculty report. And
And I
it's
think
there
that-
and it's available.
I would agree, and I think that adds to, so having ran a nonprofit here in the city, the understanding of that is that, nonprofits are limited, particularly if they're smaller, they're limited in their ability to do certain things and to be able to identify where those partners are. Some of them try to do it on their own, which is great, but what we find more often than not is that you find pockets of individuals or organizations doing the same types of work, and I see often where the university can serve in a role and work in collaboration so that it's not just one organization here trying to figure it out, another one over here trying to figure it out. When you've got, Dr. Reid and the work that they're doing there that sits right here on campus, there are automatic cohesions that are built that we should be building upon. So then we can say, you know what, I can just go here and look and find information or connect with professors, students, this, that, and the other, that can help us advance the work that I'm doing in my respective neighborhood.
So Neil, perhaps you can give us some examples. The university has taken a great pride in recent years of being an engaged, a collaborative university, an urban metropolitan university. You've been here 20 years, and with your work with the Jack Ford Urban Affairs Center and your collaboration, also just being familiar here at university with their faculty and what they're doing. Perhaps the audience might be interested in knowing some of the work that's going on and some of the building blocks that sort of exist already here that we can expand upon.
Before I do that, I just want to kind of respond to something Michael said when you talked about purchasing from locally based businesses. And we have a kind of slogan here in Toledo, it matters where you make it. Maybe we should extend that or have a sister slogan that says it matters from where you buy it, because I think that is a critically important point. In terms of University of Toledo, I think one thing that's really important to understand is when we think of knowledge, when we think of ideas, knowledge is in no way restricted. And it should not certainly be restricted by disciplinary boundaries. And if you look at some of the best ideas that are coming out of research, the most important advances in our understanding, some of the most effective teaching, it happens when people from different disciplines, different backgrounds, and different perspectives come together and share their ideas and share their perspectives. It really comes back to diversity, and diversity of ideas and diversity of perspectives, and respecting those different ideas and perspectives, combining those in new ways that are exciting. And many of the challenges that we face as a society, globally and also here in Toledo, are best addressed by multidisciplinary perspectives and research teams. In the social sciences, it's becoming less common for the single professor to sit in his or her office and do his or her research. It's being part of a research team because that's where the new ideas often come from. And I think the University of Toledo is actually packed with examples of kind of productive cross-disciplinary collaborations that advance knowledge and build a better society. And I was going to give 3 examples of these, and Michael's actually already talked about one of those. So it's interesting that Michael, as an outsider, recognizes the importance of our disability studies program. As an insider, I also recognize the importance of that. So I really have to say no more about that except to kind of echo what Michael said. Most of us here in the audience were in Toledo in 2014 when we had the water crisis. If you remember, there were, because of the algae bloom and the microcystin toxin, there were 2.5 days when we could not drink the water. And what I think was one of the most remarkable things about that event was the way in which the University of Toledo responded to that event. And within about 2 or 3 days of the event, thanks to the hard work of Frank Calzanetti, the University of Toledo had organized a public forum in which we brought together 6 or 7 experts, again, not from one discipline, but from multiple disciplines, and not just from the University of Toledo, but also from Bowling Green State University. So we had people there with expertise in environmental planning, environmental law, gastroenterology, ecology, water treatment science. And we held a public forum because people in Toledo were concerned and they were a little scared, I guess. And what we were able to achieve was to bring these experts together, hold this public forum. Over 200 people attended, listened to the insights from these experts, were able to ask questions as well. And so I think that was an example of how the University of Toledo can respond very quickly to a crisis that's happening within the community and provide very valuable knowledge, very important and valuable knowledge and expertise. And since that public forum, again, thanks to the leadership of Frank Calzanetti, we established a water task force, which again comprises somewhere between 15 and 20 scientists from across campus. Again, not just the water scientists, but also people from the law school, people from the arts and sciences, people from the business school. And we meet on a regular basis, and what we've now done is we've established small research teams multidisciplinary research teams looking at various aspects of Lake Erie and the challenges which we have with water in this community. Because we sit in a very important place with regard to water. Michael comes from California. I'm sure he can tell us about the challenges of water out there. And so we have this tremendous resource right on our doorstep. And I think the University of Toledo can play a very important role in kind of looking after that, in understanding that, and be on the leading edge of science when it comes to this particular area of research. And while we can certainly partner with other institutions like Ohio State University, we have a lot of expertise there. And we don't always need to bring experts in from outside to address this problem. We have a lot of this expertise here. Another kind of interdisciplinary initiative I want to kind of mention, and this is one which is really in the kind of formative stages, and many of you may not even know about this. The only reason I know about this is because I'm on the committee that's kind of looking at this, and that's the issue of cybersecurity. Thanks to our engineering school, we are in the beginnings of a discussion about putting together a degree program, perhaps a certificate program, again, which is going to be kind of multidisciplinary, looking at this issue of cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is a huge issue and will continue to be a huge issue, whether it's personal theft of your identity, whether it's cyber attacks on our financial system, consumer devices, public utilities, military systems. It's a very important topic. So within this committee, we have people from geography and planning, people from engineering, people from criminal justice, people from information systems, sociology, mathematics, all trying to think about how we can craft together, again, either a certificate program or perhaps even a degree program which addresses this very important issue. And then once we establish the kind of academic program moving forward, thinking about what is the research agenda around this that we can perhaps develop and contribute to.
Thank you. Well, John, we know collaboration is a two-way street. I mean, the university is trying to get engaged. What about from the view of the community? Maybe some examples and some thoughts as to how we could work better together, or some of the things we could take advantage of, leverage opportunities, skill sets in our community. What's your some thoughts in that area?
Absolutely. One of the things that I like to share or say often is leadership matters. So at the end of the day, good leadership, there is no substitute for it. Just 2 weeks ago, Dr. Reardon, I was in Memphis for a convention, National Baptist Convention, and so our group that traveled, it was my parents and a couple other folks, we went to the Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel. And in going there, and I've been to a couple different civil rights museums, that was my first time going to the one at the Lorraine Motel. In going there, what struck me and what continues to strike me is when you think about the civil rights movement and what happened during that period of time, everyone chooses, which is not bad at all, but everyone chooses to focus on Dr. King and what he shared and his leadership and what he did during that moment, the March on Washington, his comments there. But what strikes me more is the fact that there were hundreds of leaders inside of the civil rights movement. So when we talk about champions, there were, you really can't even count them because you wouldn't even know some of the names. Some you may know, people like Billy Kiles, who was a pastor at that time of a church down there still living, Dr. Abernathy, and you can walk through the list of names of folks who helped to lead during that stretch of time. Dr. King gets most of the credit, most of the notoriety today, and rightly so, and that is huge, but there were so many other individuals who played a part in championing that space. And so then what I do is sort of translate that and say, in Toledo, what does that look like? And so we can try to identify one or two champions, and so we've talked about some of the things that are happening now. So clearly, ProMedica has made, with underneath our leadership with Randy Ostra and others, we've made a very conscious decision that we want to move downtown with a corporate headquarters, which is spurring economic development in many ways, in concert with the university, the academic affiliation that's going to go on there, that is already starting to move, but there are other organizations, there are other individuals, whether that's in the nonprofit sector, in the education arena. You can look at Toledo Public Schools, the leadership that exists there, not just Dr. Durant, who's phenomenal, but there are others inside of that space who are helping to lead. You can look even at our arts community or cultural spaces, whether that's the Mud Hens, the Walleye, the Zoo, Imagination Station. You can walk a list of things that are there that are critical, and what it ultimately boils down to is leadership matters. How do you build that collaborative two-way street? There is no collaboration unless there's two sides to it. So people use the word collaboration often. Unfortunately, some of what we see is not collaboration. Some of what we see could be greater collaboration, but it takes leadership to drive that initiative forward. Oftentimes, I've seen, and it happens, and sometimes good, sometimes bad, leaders get in a room and they have a conversation and then they say, okay, all right, we're gonna go do it. And then the people who are underneath there don't really catch the vision of the leader, and so then some of that collaboration starts to wane and to fall off, which is why it takes a will inside of that space to get that done. And I look at this room, folks in this room, the students that are here, the faculty that are here, the community members that are here, it takes all of us to really drive that effort forward. And so I like to see, or I would like to look at it from the perspective that each one of us in our own way are champions and leaders in some respect, because even if I have a department of 10 people and I can lead them in keeping with a greater vision, then we see leadership happen, because it's impossible to say Dr. Gaber walking in the door is going to say, hey, we're going to go do this. And it's a sweeping change all over the board. No, it's going to take leaders inside of not just this space, but inside of our entire community in order to drive that space. And I think that it's not just the Toledo effort, but it's the greater Toledo space. When I look at the title for today, that moving from knowledge to action is not just Toledo proper, but it's all those spaces around us, going down to Wood County and our adjacent counties that are touching us. And the last thing I want to touch on is the conversation around supplier diversity, which I think is huge. The concept of being able to buy local, but also to focus on those women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, disabled owners who are running businesses. How do we ensure that we're building that base? Because that grows a greater Toledo at the end of the day by having that diversity of supply. So then people are able to come to the table and not only build, but then they're able to go out and employ, which creates a better tax base, which creates more economic development, and the engine continues to move.
Great. Well, as we sort of wrap up our discussion we've been having here, I think it's time really to get to a key point here, and we have some great expertise, a lot of good comments made. Let's see if we can come up with some good steps forward. What kind of recommendations can we make? Where do we need to move forward and actually see this being implemented? We've talked about many of the broad issues. Let's see if we can get some specific recommendations. And let's put some people on the spot here today and see what they're willing to step up. And Ken, you're sitting here thinking very hard. I'm sure you've got some. So let's start with you.
Well, two quick things. One is coming in from the airport, the Detroit airport. We didn't come in the Toledo airport. A good chunk of my journey, which was very interesting thanks to the driver, was very slow traffic through lots of spaces within the Toledo region. So obviously transportation is an issue that needs to be addressed in a slightly different way. I think one of the things the campus can look at is how can it challenge all of its members, all of its community contributors, to reducing the carbon footprint of the University of Toledo, to make that a subject of rigorous study on this campus, to look at how we get people on and off campus, the way we use resources, the way electricity is handled, to see what we can do to reduce in a very systematic way our drain and negative impact on our own environment and our nearby adjacent neighborhoods. In doing so, we're also going to be generating a new generation of Toledo leadership that no matter what sector they go into, corporate, nonprofit, or public, they're going to be conscious of the fact that, climate change is a reality and we all have a role to play in it. I think that would distinguish Toledo in just another important way. I also like the comments that you made about the importance of perhaps establishing minority and women business enterprise standards terms of how we spend our resources. But the other issue is if other institutions begin to do that, and that's obviously a direction we need to go in because there's an uneven distribution of economic opportunity in our city, right, in your city, is we also have to build the capacity of those minority and women-owned businesses. And you've got terrific business capacity here. You're a graduate of the MBA program. What can we do to very systematically enhance the leadership and capacity of that sector so opportunities that become available through minority business enterprise standards can actually be realized and taken advantage of because we, in essence, preparing that next generation of business leadership. I think the last thing is one of the things we're nervous about, we talk about the engagement agenda, is what gets on the university's advancement agenda. And I'd argue that there's a very substantial portion of our alums, no matter what institution we're at, whose most transformative experience at our universities is connecting what they learn in the classroom to making meaningful change in the community. But when you look at the advancement agenda, what are we asking people who are alums and friends to invest in? That's often not present. And I think we have an opportunity to not displace the need for new science facilities, new technology on the campus, but to add the opportunity to invest in the engagement agenda of the campus. And here we could also offer folks who are longtime civic leaders who've helped transform organizations and communities, perhaps fellowships on campus, to spend time at the University of Toledo, bought out from some of their community responsibilities and corporate responsibilities, to reflect upon that experience, write about and contribute to the literature, also work much more intimately with our students and faculty to shape what we're teaching and learning, and give them an opportunity to be recognized for the leadership role that they've played in the region by bringing them on as honored, learned instructors on the campus through that new fund for engagement.
Great. Michael, some of your thoughts.
Excuse me. This has been a very, very interesting discussion to me. I've learned a lot. And I've got a few observations, I think, based on what I've heard rather than specific recommendations. I'm a fan of prosperous, livable Toledo. So I'm leading the PLT program at the moment. And like Ken, I mean, I'm referring to the limo drivers as the source of all wisdom now, because my limo driver from Detroit basically said, finish the freeways, just finish the freeways. So I'll just pass that message on to you. His name is James. He was a fine guy. But I mean, I think this, what John was saying a moment ago is so important in terms of leadership and the way the leadership comes from so many different sources. Because we've seen so many instances in this country where leadership and change started at the grassroots. I'm thinking actually of Ferguson at the moment, where people just said enough already, and that's created a national movement, a national conversation about race. And one of the things that I would like to make sure that comes along with this, especially in a university setting, is that we actually confront the difficult problems. I'm sure water is very important to us, Neil. I totally agree with that. But some of the other issues that we've talked about, and we haven't, I don't think, hesitated about difficult conversations this morning, but the Black Lives Matter thing and other variations on social issues which confront this country right now, inequality and so on, have to be high on the agendas, even in their local manifestations here. The other thing that I picked up, I think, a lot was there's the importance of leadership, but the importance of collaboration then as well for these things to work. Social contracts, social compacts are not easy things to maintain. It requires an openness and a commitment over a long haul. And I've heard people, and this is encouraging, I've heard people on the panel talking about that long-term commitment from ProMedica, from university in particular. If we can be doing these things, I think they're concrete enough to give us some guidance about the nature of the agenda that we're dealing with. But I also will just end up with one thing, because I want to hear from what you local people are saying as well, that in terms of a good social contract, in terms of good participation, the University of Toledo seems to has a job ahead of it in terms of communication. We've said there's so many interesting things and important things going on at the university. I think it's the university's responsibility to communicate those contributions perhaps more effectively than it has done. There's some very fine researchers and research going on in this university. The research is part of the other mission with teaching as well, which is, I think, fundamental to the nature of a contemporary university, fundamental to a survival of a research university in the current world. And building on the resources that we've got and the work that we actually do already seems to be so important in terms of not only delivering to the community, but also delivering to our students. And then when we invite our students back, Ken, to become collaborators, they are coming back and using and they're giving back with their information and their practice. I think that nature of the dynamic way of research and teaching coming together, creating prepared scholars and citizens, and then those prepared scholars and citizens then coming back to the university to create a better society. It sounds altruistic, but that's really the way it works. That's how I feel.
Good. John, what do you think?
As all great academicians do, they sort of jump out ahead of the curve. And so he touched on a couple points that I wanted to share from a social justice perspective. So when you think about things that are happening right now, and Doc, you mentioned it from a Black Lives Matter, Michael, I'm sorry. You mentioned it from a Black Lives Matter movement perspective, and wherever you fall on that, whatever side of the discussion you fall on it, the conversation has to be had that there are great disparities that exist yet and still in our country. And how can the university help be, again, that cradle of intelligence to ensure that the voice is heard? And I think that is the critical component of this. So when you think about social justice, healthcare is a social justice issue. When you think about folks go to bed, more people go to bed hungry every night. When you think about the fact that students come into school, and I've seen this personally, this isn't about a statistic, when students come to school and they're eating hot fries and drinking Tahitian treat, for those of y'all that may not know Tahitian treat, go to your corner store, you might find some. So you might have to stop me because I feel preacher coming. But when kids do that, and then you stop them and you say, okay, so why are you eating? And I've seen this happen. The student is quote unquote reprimanded because they're eating in school. But if you take a couple more seconds to have the conversation, they're eating the Cheetos, the hot fries, the Tahitian treat because they didn't have breakfast that morning. Because mama had to work 2 jobs, so she was already gone out the house, and big brother had to get to school before she did, and so they're all moving in different directions. That's a very real existence. And it's not just a real existence for African American children, it's a real existence for children, period, because poverty is a very real discussion. And so when you think about the social justice component of this, healthcare being a major social justice issue, how do you combat hunger? Which one of the things that ProMedica has taken on is how do you combat hunger, but then how do you work in partnership with individuals who are able to help you do that? And so I think in Toledo, to move towards the actionable space is really identifying what are some of those key issues, but not limiting yourself and saying, oh, we can only focus on one at a time. One of the things that I learned through my MBA experience, 12 months, we had to get a lot of stuff done, just like that. And people are able to do it. And I think we have to challenge ourselves to be able to think far enough down the road and be able to look far enough down the road that we can say, I'm okay with being able to, quote unquote, multitask, because there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. And we're fortunate because we have a university that allows that to happen, because there are many experts, if I can use that word, and I use that lightly, but there are many people with the expertise who we can bring to bear against the social issues that we encounter.
Good point. Neil, any kind of reflective comment?
I think, going forward, we're going to make a lot of decisions about what to invest in, which direction we want the city to go in, the community. And one thing I think that's going to be really important is data. having the correct data to help us make informed decisions. One thing you find out is lots of people have opinions and they think they know the answers, but when they see the data, it sometimes makes them step back and think about it. So one of the initiatives that we have at the Jack Ford Urban Affairs Center is we are in the process of putting together a brand new product. I have a brochure here. It's going to be called Toledo Biz View, and this is going to be a one-stop online data warehouse, initially for Lucas County, but then for the entire Northwest Ohio region. And this is going to be a data warehouse which will be accessible to the public. It will be online, it will be web-based, and we are basically going to amass and compile and put in a geographically referenced database all the economic and social data that we can get our hands on for Lucas County and Northwest Ohio. And so the user will be able to access that, inspect it, depict it, retrieve it. If they don't want to do that, we'll do that for them. So we will provide customized data bundling services. We will provide training. We will also provide analysis. And I'll just give you one example of how we've already done that. About 3 months ago, I was approached by Adelante, who are a Hispanic advocacy group here in Lucas County. And the individual I spoke with was interested in getting some data about the Latino population of Lucas County. He said there's a lot of conversation going on. There's a lot of people think they know about the kind of demographics and the geography of the Hispanic population or the Latino population, but I don't think they do. And what we need is some data to kind of back up these conversations and to help us make decisions. So what we were able to do, working with a graduate student, is to put together an atlas of the Latino population in Lucas County and to provide that to Adelante and to say, look, here's what the data show about this particular population, where they are, and different characteristics of the population. And that's very useful to Adelante because they now have information and hard data which can then help them make more informed decisions. And I think that having good data is important, and there is no one-stop shop for data in Northwest Ohio. So to kind of quote Peter Uvagi, we are going to become the Switzerland of data for Northwest Ohio. And once we have, and we're going to roll this out in January, and once we have that, and once we have it up and running, the next thing we're going to do, and I know this is something that Dan Johnson has championed for a number of years, is to put together a community scorecard. In other words, we make all these economic decisions, we make all these investments, but then the question becomes, how are we doing? Are we moving the ball down the field, or are we moving backwards? And so associated with this data warehouse, this data repository, we will start to produce an annual kind of community scorecard, which will allow the community to see on some key indicators whether we're progressing, whether we're moving backwards, whether we're standing still. And I think that's going to be very useful in terms of, just measuring the progress we are making or measuring the progress that we're not making.
President Gabriel, any concluding remarks or thoughts of what you've heard so far this morning?
Yes, thank you. It's very interesting. So this is Inauguration Day, and in the midst of all of that, what's interesting is the vast amount of challenges and opportunities that we've discussed here. And I think Reverend Jones really pointed out, I have the good fortune of being an individual that we're actually investing as the president here, and yet what I need are all of the other leaders, those of you who are here, those of you who are committed to both the university and this community, to say, okay, this is what we're going to do going forward. It's not about an individual's leadership, it's about our collective leadership and how we are going to embrace this and continue to make progress. I've said all along, what excites me is being at a university that doesn't turn its back on the community, that wants to be a part of the community. That's what excited me about coming to Toledo. And as we've talked about some of the issues that we face and knowing what we have to do, I ask you and I need you all to be a part of that and to continue to think about how do we embrace the community, how do we have an impact because we can and we will, and how do we bring others into that conversation to engage, because it is so critical to continuing to transform Toledo and recognizing that the University of Toledo and Toledo's prosperity moves together. So what I'd say, and I hear the bells ringing, perfect timing, I'd say that together we're going to continue to make progress, that really the social compact has been in place, and really we're recommitting to working, to being that set of partners, and that it will take each of you doing the things that you're interested in doing. So for the individual who's a biology major, thinking about what does that mean working in the public schools and helping kids, whether it's with tutoring or after school or literacy, or if you're a health science major, what does that work look like in working with kids or adults and thinking about their health care. And one quick story, since they were telling stories, one of my first interactions with Michael Deere was a class that I took, and I was 21 at the time, so you think about this, and our class, he said, okay, we're going into Skid Row and we're interviewing homeless people to talk about what are their needs and how did they get here and what do we need to do to plan. And, you know, of course I called my mom and said, okay, here's what's going on, I want you to know this. I sat there and interviewed a gentleman who said he'd gotten out of prison the day before for murder, and actually, you know, was talking about, here's where I am, I'm on the streets. And it was very interesting as a 21-year-old to sit there and have that conversation and think about how that impacted the next set of work that I did and the dissertation that I did on homelessness and thinking about what that means for a city. So for each one of us here, you can and you should be engaging in the community, thinking about how that transforms their lives. We wound up putting together a plan associated with housing in Skid Row for individuals that needed those resources, but then thinking about how it will continue to transform your life also to be able to do things later on in your career. So with that, I thank you all very much. Thanks for being here as part of this day, which is fantastic, and thanks for caring to be here and thinking about what is it you can do to help the university and help the city of Toledo. I also want to make sure we thank Patrick, who tried to tease this out of each one of us and lead this conversation, and we're very appreciative to him. Thank you all very much.
All right. So as promised, we have an opportunity here for questions from the audience. We have a microphone set at the end of each aisle here. If you can come down and maybe introduce yourself, your affiliation, and direct your question to the panel as a whole, or if you'd like to direct it to an individual, please do so. So, there's a mic so we can hear you. Can you just use the mics, please? Step up here so I can see. So we start right over here, then, gentlemen. You're first.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I think this was an enlightening discussion on many levels, and I love the perspective outside of just this area, and I appreciate it. A lot of the themes today were, my name is Scott McIntyre, by the way. I'm a recent appointee as Interim Director of Student Entrepreneurship and Engagement. So many of the tasks that I have touch on the issues that you have, including diversity, social contract, and economic development, ultimately. So I wonder if you have any stories to share, any observations on how areas that you've been influencing or part of have impacted entrepreneurship development, because, you know, we tend to focus here a lot on existing industries and old ways of thinking, and we have an amazing and diverse population of people with great ideas. So how would entrepreneurship fold into the discussion that you've had today?
Whoever wants to jump into the fray.
Well, I'll jump in from this perspective because I think entrepreneurs bring something unique and invaluable to the table because they already walk in with a thought process of how do I meet a need that exists in the space that I'm in. That's where many entrepreneurs are born and developed. And I believe that small businesses play such a huge role within our community. So we can talk about the big businesses and this, that, and the other, that's great. But if we, going back to data, Dr. Reid, look at the statistics that are there, it is the small business owner and the entrepreneur who really assist in driving the economic engine. And so what I would say inside of the space, particularly here in Toledo, is one, continue to cultivate that kind of thought process, allow entrepreneurs to also learn from a big business, because the reality is that there are many things that happen in a larger corporate environment that impact small businesses, but oftentimes small businesses think small, and so they have to be able to think in the larger global economy, which you were speaking to earlier, Michael. And I think it's that kind of space is encouraging that thought process through.
Two examples. In Rochester, the University of Rochester, in cooperation with some of the larger corporations located in that city, have created entrepreneurship clubs, after-school activities for school-age children in their public library system at 12 different locations throughout the city. And some of the most successful corporate entrepreneurs are serving as both funders and mentors for that project. And a similar thing is underway with the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, where CE, combustion engineering, and now the North American, at least for the moment, division of Volkswagen, which recently opened up a major facility there, are involved in using the public library system and its access to the latest bandwidth to do extraordinary communications-based, digitally based businesses with elementary and middle school students. And these libraries are packed, and there's enormous energy, and they're bringing it back into their public schools, which is terrific.
I have to say something about that as well, because it's a very important point that these gentlemen are making. But one of the things that we observe, and you'll guess what I'm going to say if I live in the Bay Area, is releasing the potential that are in all the individuals, not as in, only as entrepreneurs, but as creative people. I mean, everybody talks these days about the maker economy. And universities, I think, can make good contributions in creating spaces where these creative individuals can get together and work. People, in a sense, don't need an entrepreneur to be creative, but they might need help then to create work, create jobs, create money, whatever they want to create. And that broader context of creating places and spaces where this work can occur is, I think, as important as recognizing what entrepreneurship is required.
And then looking at how the city, the county, and the state are spending their economic development dollars so that it's not all, mega projects in the downtown or along the waterfront and for industrial smokestack chasing, but there's a portion of our public resources for economic development that are set aside for neighborhood-based commerce and industry. And that's serious. And then for firms that do get the benefit of mega project investment, Memphis that's the way we roll there. To enforce local minority and women-owned entrepreneurship standards and help them take advantage of that so that there is a trickle-down.
But private corporations can do that too, Ken. We don't have to say, well, the local government will just do it for us and we need more money from the government, because people like this, like John and ProMedica, I mean, private corporations can also set aside those development dollars to, it's a small amount of money, but it can have a massive impact on people's lives.
And UT is fortunate because they house, the MBDC. They just got funding for the Minority Business Assistance Center. You got Rocket Ventures. There's a lot of different spaces here.
Toledo, the Rocket City.
Yeah, well, we're the Rockets here, so.
We are.
That's where that comes from.
Sorry.
That's right.
Good idea, man.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, and thank you. The panel was very inspiring today. I just wanted to say that we are the Rust Belt city still, but this alchemy that it's going to take to have the leadership and the collaboration work together is never going to work without trust. And so may I suggest that we move from the Rust Belt city to Trust Belt city.
Nice.
That's very good.
Point well taken.
That is good. Steal that.
Yeah. Trust Bell.
Got such a lot of good ideas now.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Betty Anzaldua. I don't know if this is on.
Yes.
I had a couple of comments that I want to make and share with you. And you talked about data and communication being key. And so I want to talk about a data problem and then also to communicate some collaboration efforts. So I'm Latina, and I graduated from Wade High School, went on to Oberlin, and got my MBA here and in law school. So I've been part of the community for a long time, have left the area, worked in Detroit, and have seen other communities work and in action. So I'm also a grant writer. So when I hear about money, you know, my ears kind of perk up. And years ago, there was a grant for African American males, a dropout. It was about 5 or 6 years ago. There was a dropout problem, a graduation problem. And I said, how about Latinos? Because 20 years ago, I heard our graduation rate was about 50%. And I was told by somebody from a county education entity, oh, Latinos don't have a problem. You graduate at 85%, and so you're not eligible. So I was recently at a meeting where Aspire did a presentation, and they've changed their slogan, but it was basically from cradle to grave, an educational collaborative effort, and they picked East Toledo 43605 zip code for their pilot study. And Wade High School has, I think, a third Latino enrollment. And in their data, Latinos are doing very well at third grade testing, but by high school, they're doing worse than all their peer segments. So there's a problem there. I said, what's the graduation rate? We have been asking for this data for years. And she said the graduation rate for Wade High School for Latinos was 37%. And I said, what? We're in crisis, and we don't even know it. We need data. And I asked her to give me that in writing, and I will share it with the Latino leaders. And I've spoken with the commissioner and also at the state level to alert my peers that we have a problem here. So, Anil, that has been a real problem that we've had. And then also, what is the graduation rate? Is it people enrolling in 9th grade to 12th grade? There's a huge dropout, apparently 7th and 8th grade level. So that students in transition and moving, they look at graduations in maybe one particular school. So there's real problems there. We need to know where we are so we can, have a strategy, and it needs to be very broad. The other, I'm on a United Way Health Committee, and United Way in our community has done a great effort in working collaboratively. There's health, income, and education. They're trying to work to make a difference. Hunger is a problem. 25% of our people are below poverty. And so there's policy changes, people working in committees. TPS has free breakfasts now for kids. Kids are urged to come to school early so you can have breakfast, and then they're in a mindset to learn. Okay, so there's that backdrop. And then I saw a presentation on infant mortality. And it was Black. Infant mortality is atrocious. I don't have the numbers in my head, but the county is like one of the worst in the state, Ohio, and Ohio is like at the bottom of the rung, like maybe third in the bottom of all the states in infant mortality for Blacks. And then I saw the data, and it was Black infant mortality, white infant mortality. And I said, well, where's the Latino infant mortality? Because we have a very high birth rate. I just have to look at my extended family and see that. And it wasn't there. It wasn't there. So I said, well, let me look at the county data. That was the health department giving me that. It wasn't there. I said, well, let me look at the state level. And guess what? I saw infant mortality, and it said white, non-Hispanic data, Black, non-Hispanic, total infant mortality. We were not even on the chart. And I listened to the tapes that were on the website. And so I alerted the local perinatal care or collaborative, infant mortality collaborative, and they said, wow, can you be on our committee? Because we have to have a voice. We have to be at the table for even people to recognize that there is possibly an issue here. So I just want to say that we need to work, we have a lot of work to do, and Latinos do exist, we're not invisible. And then let's move to the MBE Edge space. We do have the University of Toledo is a leader in MBE Edge collaboration. We have a minority business incubator over at Scott Park. We've recently got state dollars awarded for a 2-year period. And the city and the county and the zoo, all these anchor institutions come to that collaborative meeting, and we're all working for a framework to move suppliers to increase the number there. So there is collaboration. I just want to tell you that. So then we need a communication. We need to get that word out, that we are doing things.
So what I want to say is we want to engage you, and we appreciate your comments, and I think Neil will probably want to look at the data. And unfortunately, we have to wrap up now because of just the timing. But I think it's important to be able to, as he's putting together really this repository.
Yeah, and just one other comment is I think one of the things we want to do is not just amass and assemble the data that does exist,
Make
but
sure it's useful.
also identify what data does not exist.
Right.
And either because it doesn't exist or it's very difficult to get.
Right.
And then to start to work with groups to advocate that we need to start collecting these data at this particular jurisdiction or whatever.
So I'd encourage, I think it would be helpful to make sure we make that connection. Yes. But thank you all very much. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. Thanks.
Good work.